I was only about 6 years old at the time. My mother led me for so long through the woods along a trail barely comprehensible, until we finally reached the old mansion. It was far less decayed back then, still having electricity and running water, but somehow still felt run down, ancient. "Why are we here?" I remember asking her. I was scared. Maybe she could see it. She looked at me with eyes that I thought expressed annoyance, but I now know conveyed pity. She didn't answer. Instead, she motioned for me to go inside. I knew from the moment I first stepped inside that I would hate this place. It felt lonely, destitute. My mother led me upstairs and pointed towards a door. "You have to go in there," she told me. "Why?" I started to ask, but she cut me off. "You need to," she said. I did as I was told. I was only a child after all. After I stepped into the room, she slammed the door shut behind me. I heard her bolting it from the other side. I hit at it. "Mom, what are you doing?" She was crying when she responded. "Something is coming for you. You need to stay here, to stay safe." She used the word something in describing what was coming for me. Something. She wasn't using the word monster yet, but she would. Yes, she most certainly would. It was a bathroom she had locked me in, antiquated and rotting. The toilet still functioned, and there was running water, but it was otherwise decrepit and run down. There was a gap between the bottom of the door and the floorboard, big enough for food to be slid under. I would stay locked in that room for weeks, maybe even months, because a monster was coming after me, don't you know? A monster. "Mother!" I remember shouting through the door after a couple of days. "Won't the monster kill you when it arrives? Shouldn't you be in here with me?" But she told me she was safe, that the monster couldn't hurt her, and it was me that it was after. She slid food under the gap 3 times a day, and I was always grateful for it. Sometimes she would read stories to me, sitting against the door. She would tell me it wouldn't be long now. After the monster came, I could come out. I was scared and alone in that bathroom. Sometimes I would think back to when I was younger. I would be lying in bed at night, listening to my mother sing me my favorite lullabies, telling me everything was okay, that I should go to sleep, that there was nothing to worry about. She would run her fingers through my hair when she did it. I would stare out of my bedroom window as she sang, looking up at the stars. They seemed to twinkle in the rhythm of her voice. I started singing those lullabies, locked in that room, thinking of those times with my mother, hoping one day life would go back to that. Sometimes she would sit outside the locked door and sing along with me. I liked when she did that. It was the closest I had to what had previously been standard for me. Sometimes I would be fast asleep lying in that room, and would awaken to a fierce growl or roar echoing throughout the old house. I knew the monster was here. I would jump up in a flash and yell for my mother. She would assure me that she was fine. "The monster can't hurt me," she reminded me. "You're just lucky you're locked safely in that room," she would say. But I started to question how safe I truly was. One night, after a few weeks in that bathroom, I had a terrible nightmare. I remember it vividly. My mother stood outside the door and told me that the monster left last night, that it was safe to come out now. Then, she unlocked the door. But when it opened, it wasn't my mother standing on the other side. It was the monster. It was grotesque looking, like nothing from this world. It lunged at me and began to rip me apart. It didn't feel like a dream anymore. The pain felt real. It was eating me alive, taking large chunks of my flesh and devouring me. It was surreal, and it went on for minutes. It was like nothing I thought could ever happen, and slowly my consciousness started to fade away. The world grew darker around me, and the pain receded. Eventually, there was no longer any pain at all, just darkness, all-encompassing darkness. I was dead. And the moment it felt as though death was finally settling in was the precise moment when I woke up. Still in lightlessness, I thought I was truly dead for a moment. That death was just quiet darkness. But it was just that the bathroom light had burned out. "Mom!" I shouted. "It's really dark in here." She didn't respond to me. I could hear her crying as she walked away from the door. So from that moment forward, my time in that room was in complete and utter darkness. I'm not sure how many weeks passed after that, but I would still wake up to the sounds of the monster. It was happening more and more frequently. I could never hear it clearly while listening for it, but those growls and shrieks would wake me from my sleep. My mother would stay by the door less and less. And then, one day I noticed her sliding far more food than usual underneath the door. Weeks worth of food. I knew what it meant. She was going to leave me. I couldn't bear it. I began pounding on the door. "Mother, please let me out of here. I don't care about the monster. I don't care. Just let me out. I can't stay in here anymore." She didn't respond to me. Instead, she sat by the door and sang to me, my favorite lullabies from when I was younger. All night she sang. She was crying at the same time, but still singing. I should have cherished it. I should have listened and relished in those last moments we had together. But I didn't. I just pounded on the door the entire night, screaming at her, begging for her to let me out. After uncountable hours, she finally stopped singing. "Goodbye, my son," she said. Her footsteps echoed as she made her way down the stairs, and I heard the front door quietly close behind her. I was by myself now, alone in the dark, locked in, abandoned. Words can't describe the betrayal I felt, the loneliness, the seclusion and desolation. Even with everything that's happened since, I can say with certainty that that was the worst I have ever felt. Nothing will ever be able to match it. Those last few days were unbearable. I was still in pitch blackness, and I had eaten the last of my food. I thought I was going to starve. But then, I started to feel something new, something I had repressed for all this time. Anger. Anger at being abandoned. Anger for being lonely. Anger for being locked away from the world. Fury. Rage. I went to the bathroom door and struck it as hard as I could. The door shattered away before me. Light shone in, and I could see myself. My hands were massive and hideous. I saw the debris of the door littered before me, and that's when I became aware of it. I had finally realized I was the monster. I suppose my mother knew what I was turning into, and she had a tough choice to make. She could have ended my life and spared the world of what I would become. But I guess she couldn't bear it. I suppose she thought of me living on in some way was better than me not living at all. I think back now and realize how horrible those weeks must have been for her as well. as I slowly transformed into this beast. You see, I can think these thoughts and write these words, but if I tried to speak to you, you wouldn't understand me. It would sound normal to me, but what you would hear would be the shrieks and growls of a monstrous creature. I suppose I was making those sounds as I slept, and would sometimes wake myself up. And that last day when she sang to me for hours, I see what that must have been like for her. I hid at the door begging for her to let me out. But what she must have heard was a horrible feral monster smashing at the door trying to break through. But still, she stayed all night, singing to me. Maybe she correctly guessed that some part of me could still understand. Countless years have passed since then. What was already an ancient house back then is in far worse shape now. And I hate this place just as much as I knew I would from the moment I stepped in. At night, I run through the local woods catching wildlife. It's what I live off of now. Sometimes, I see some brave townsfolk venturing into these woods. I've even tried talking to them a few times, but they don't understand me. And oh, how scared they were. How they ran. How they screamed. I suppose the town at the end of the forest must have many tales about me. The disgusting and ghastly monster of the old mansion. I'm probably the boogeyman that will come after misbehaving children. The shadow peering back at them from the darkness of the woods. And sometimes, on the calmest of nights, they may even hear the horrifying shrieks, squeals, and growls echoing down onto the town from the trees above. Oh, how it must scare the children. But I hope this letter reaches you all in good form. This is my tale. My story. This is what I am. I mean you all no harm. And you can tell those children that what they hear isn't so unnatural. Tell them that I wasn't always so different from them, and those sounds aren't as they appear. No matter how scary they sound on those calm, windless nights, they come from a sad, lonely, and broken creature as it looks up towards the stars at night and watches them twinkle, singing its favorite lullabies. I just got back from going on my dream vacation to Japan. For the most part, it was awesome, and everything seemed to go off without a hitch. All of my flights were on time, the language barrier wasn't too bad, though in some of the more secluded areas it was kind of hard to communicate. Getting around was actually quite easy, once you understand how transportation works there. I managed to see most of everything on my itinerary. The food was phenomenal. However, there was only one sore spot about my trip that really stands out, and that's the night I stayed at a capsule hotel. I was supposed to stay there for 3 nights, but after the first night, I ended up using all of my emergency funds to pay for a proper hotel for the next 2 nights. I think you'll understand why after you hear my story. I want to start off by stressing just how damn exhausted I was. This was at the tail end of a 2-week trip, where I hadn't taken a single day off, so to speak. We're talking 8 to 10 hours of walking every day, exploring the cities, going to shrines, visiting hundreds of shops, traveling all over the land. I had started the day bright and early in Osaka, soaking up every bit of the city I could, knowing that it might be the last time I got to see it. After a full day of sightseeing, I took an evening train from Osaka to Tokyo, which took about 3.5 hours. Once I was in Tokyo, I headed to Akihabara and explored. You would be amazed at all of the buildings and lights they have in that area. I spent an hour or so ducking into random shops here and there, all while dragging my luggage behind me. The squeaky wheels of my luggage seemed to draw attention from everyone I passed by. I could have left my things in a locker at the train station, but that would have meant having to double back and grab it, and I really didn't want to subject my feet to that type of abuse. I had decided on a chill evening, but I had gotten so caught up exploring the better parts of the electric town. I ended up becoming so enthralled that I didn't actually get to the capsule hotel until a little bit past midnight. So yeah, I was exhausted. I felt like I could have slept through a hurricane. After I checked into the hotel, I got a neat little bracelet with my capsule number on it, as well as a key to a small locker for my stuff. When I say small, I mean small. I somehow barely managed to wedge my oversized luggage into the compartment. I wasn't sure the door would actually close all the way. After that, I took a quick shower, and then headed directly to my capsule for some much needed sleep. If you've never heard of a capsule hotel before, don't worry, not many people have. Just imagine a morgue, except instead of a wall of tiny human freezers, it's full of neatly, slightly larger sleeping areas, tall enough to sit up and use a laptop, and just long enough to sleep in, but not much else. As I crawled into capsule 616, I noticed a little light indicator on the outside of the capsule blink on, to indicate that it was now occupied. That's pretty neat, I thought. Once inside, I pulled the little door down, played with every single knob on the wall just because I could, and once I figured out how to turn the lights off, my head hit the pillow and I was already well on my way to dreamland. For about 10 minutes. It wasn't long before I started hearing a strange voice coming through the walls beside me. I guessed the walls were a lot thinner than they looked, and that my sleep hadn't plunged into deep enough territory for me to stay unconscious, despite the mental and physical exhaustion. I tried to fall back asleep, but the voice was just loud enough to keep me awake. It was constant, and I mean seriously, non-stop whispering. I don't think she ever took the time to breathe in between the words. Imagine someone reading a book without any punctuation, just word after word without pause. This voice continued to speak like that for half an hour. Because the sound was muffled and because every syllable melded into the next one, I couldn't make out exactly what language she was speaking. You would assume it was Japanese, but I don't think it was. I'm not entirely sure. I'm not a linguistic expert. But there weren't a lot of that A sound you hear so often in Japanese, and she was hitting those R sounds clearly. So if I had to guess, I think it might have been German, possibly. Whatever language it was growing louder and was starting to freak me out. That's when I remembered the buttons on the wall of my capsule. I pawed around in the dark until I located the light switch, and then found the knob for the white noise. God bless Japan for their sweet, practical technology. My little capsule was soon filled with the soft sounds of rain and distant thunder, which was easily overpowering the voice from my neighbor's capsule. Yeah, I could still hear her, sure, but she was now a whisper in a typhoon. I dimmed the lights in my pod, closed my eyes, and all was right with the world. For, you guessed it, about 10 minutes. Intermixed with the synthetic storm was the wailing of what sounded like a tornado siren. It took me a long time to realize it wasn't meant to be there, and that it was coming from my neighbor's capsule. At this point, it was about 2 in the morning. I was tired. I was cranky. I just wanted a few hours of sleep before another fun-filled day of adventure. I was internally cursing at whatever inconsiderate tourist starts screaming in their goddamn capsule, in the middle of the goddamn night, knowing full well everyone around could hear her. In my pent-up frustration, I made my one big mistake. I slammed my fist into the wall and screamed, "Shut the hell up!" This was her invitation to start slamming back, and boy did she take it and run with it. The lady on the other side of the wall began screaming. She hit the wall so hard, I swear to God, it felt like my entire capsule was shaking. It was like she was full-on body slamming it with all her might, all while screaming so loud I could barely hear the storm anymore. I put my hand on the wall and felt it buckle and bend as she thrashed against it. I backed away, sliding up against the opposite wall, but I could still feel every slam as though it were coming from the capsule to my left instead of my right. I had had enough. I was going to see if the concierge was still awake, and see what they could do about putting me on another floor or kicking this jerk out of hers. I opened my capsule door and jumped onto solid ground. The little glowing occupied light at the foot of my capsule turned off after a few seconds. Then, the noise stopped. The banging ceased, and my breath caught in my throat. I paused briefly, looking at the light indicator under my neighbor's capsule. It was completely off. I could feel a cold sweat beginning to form along my forehead. It was just a broken light, right? That's what I hoped. But I guess I've read one too many horror stories. Because something compelled me to grab her door handle and slowly lift it. The shutter raised and I hesitantly peered inside. The entire interior of the capsule was empty. It looked as if no one had been inside this capsule for a very long time. I spent the remainder of the night sleeping on a bench in the locker room. I know I probably should have just left entirely, but I was far too tired to deal with this. The next morning, stiff and barely rested, I made my way down to the lobby and tried to explain what had happened in my pitiful excuse for Japanese. The concierge just returned a confused look, and even after using a translation service, I still didn't get anywhere, until she saw my bracelet with the room number on it. There was the slightest micro-expression of horror on her face, which I thought was odd. She grabbed my arm suddenly and pulled it towards her. She gently took the bracelet off of my wrist and flipped it around. I was supposed to be in capsule 919, not 616. That look on her face, though, I can still picture it clear as day. I have a strange feeling it wasn't just a look of, "Oh dear, you were simply in the wrong capsule." I think she knew damn well what was going on, and knew what exactly was on the inside of that other capsule. So yeah, suffice to say, I stayed in a more traditional hotel for the remainder of my trip. Living in a small town definitely has its ups and downs. On the upside, you typically don't have to deal with all the hustle and bustle that is often associated with larger cities. This is a plus, especially if you're someone like me, who absolutely despises overcrowded stores and traffic. The downside to living in a secluded part of the world is the lack of convenience. If you can't find an item you're looking for in a store, odds are you aren't going to find it anywhere in the rest of the town. Another major perk to living in a small town is the peace and quiet. You'll hear people all the time expressing their love for the serenity of a small country town, and there's a reason for it. Rarely do you hear sirens or cars laying on their horns. The most you'll hear on a calm, windless night are just the musical tunes of the crickets. I moved to this town in the south a little over a year ago. I had just finished college in the nearby city and had gotten a lucrative job as an analyst for a tech company. The job is fantastic, and it allows me to work from home, which is a huge plus for me. Not long after I acquired the job, I began house hunting. I wanted to stay in the city at first, but the farther out I searched, the more and more I found myself wanting to live in the countryside. It didn't really matter so long as I had a reliable internet connection. When I saw this house listed, I immediately knew I wanted it. Have you ever seen something and just knew you had to have it? That was the feeling I got. It was a small 3-bedroom house sitting on the edge of town. The price was so low I thought there must have been something wrong with it. But after coming out and inspecting the house for myself, I couldn't find anything amiss. The house was obviously older, but didn't seem run down or anything like that. It had a nice backyard as well, the edge of which aligned with an expansive cornfield. When I inquired about the cornfield to the realtor, she told me that there was a major farming company a few miles away and that they owned all of the farmland surrounding this town. She asked me if that would make it a deal breaker for the house, to which I declined. I thought that must have been the reason the house was so cheap. The previous owners probably disliked sharing land with a company like that. Either way, their loss is my gain. For the better part of last year, I haven't had any issue with the house whatsoever. That was until last month. I was staying up later than usual, getting through some backlogs for my work when I heard something coming from outside my window. It sounded like a woman screaming. To reiterate from earlier, this town is very quiet, so when you do happen to hear a loud noise, it cuts through the silence like butter. The scream only lasted for a few seconds, but it was enough to grab my attention away from my computer and stare out the window. Although it was dark outside, there wasn't a cloud in the sky, so the moon and the stars did a decent job of illuminating my backyard. I stood up from my chair and walked over to my window, cracking it open to listen while I scanned the surroundings. 10 minutes went by, and I heard nothing. I waited for another 10 minutes before I realized that I was just procrastinating. I shut my window, finished my work for the night, and went to bed. The next morning, after I got ready for the day, I sat out on my back porch and sipped my coffee. Even though I tried, I couldn't seem to stop thinking about that scream from the night before. I thought that maybe some kids were being reckless nearby and one of them screamed, but it didn't sound like someone having a good time. It sounded strained, like somebody in pain. I put the thought out of my mind, finished my coffee, and went inside to work. A week passed by without any more disturbances. I had almost completely forgotten about the scream I had heard. I was once again working late into the evening. When I finally finished, I sat back in my chair and rubbed my eyes after staring at my computer screen all day. I glanced out of my nearby window, and that's when I saw her. There was a woman standing in the middle of my backyard. I had to rub my eyes a second time to make sure I wasn't simply seeing things. I got up from my chair and walked over to my window once again. She was standing in my backyard, facing the cornfield. She was wearing a white dress and had short brown hair. I was wondering what she was doing standing in my backyard in the middle of the night, so I walked out of my back door to my porch. She was still standing there, motionless, facing towards the cornfield. I called out to her and asked what she was doing here, but she didn't respond. I thought that she might be lost, so I stepped off my porch and approached her. As I walked closer, I started to feel nauseous, like I was about to puke for some strange reason, but pushed the feeling aside as I was now standing directly behind the woman. I tapped her on her shoulder and once again asked what she was doing in my backyard. She slowly turned around. Her eyes were vacant, staring straight through me. I asked if she needed help, but she didn't say anything. I then told her that I was going to call somebody to come help her and for her to wait right here. As I turned around to walk back into my house, the woman grabbed my wrist. Her hand was so cold it felt like it was burning my skin. I instinctively yanked my arm away from her, and when I looked back at her face, it was partially rotting away in places. You could see patches of skull and bloody flesh across her face. I jumped back and I was about to break off into a sprint when suddenly, the woman turned back around, towards the cornfield, and silently walked into it. I had no idea what to think. I've never been big on the paranormal before, but while I held my arm under warm water and shakily sipped some whiskey with the other, I was beginning to believe in ghosts. I thought about calling the police, but I played the story back in my head. Yes, hello, officer, yeah. I saw a woman missing half her face and she disappeared into that cornfield. Go get her. If I thought I sounded insane, I could only imagine what someone else might think. Another week passed by with nothing out of the ordinary. I heard no more screams, nor did I see that woman again. I did, however, see something strange. Well, I didn't see it exactly. This time I was laying in my bed watching some TV before going to sleep, when I glanced out of my window. The cornfield outside was moving erratically. I fixed my full attention on the window. I could see slightly above the top of the corn from my window, and it looked as if something was sprinting through it. I silently crept over to my window to get a better look, and I watched as the line of shifting corn started moving towards my backyard. I wondered if maybe a wild animal or something had somehow made its way into the field and was looking for a way out. The corn suddenly parted at the edge of my backyard, and I didn't see anything. It was like a gust of wind had pushed aside 2 stalks of corn. I waited for a few minutes, staring intently. Then, the corn parted once again, and I watched as it trailed away. Either my eyes are absolutely awful, or I just saw something invisible moving through that cornfield. A few days ago, I received a knock on my door. It was the police. The officer stood rigid with a hand resting on his pistol belt when I answered the door. He apologized for disturbing me, but then he told me he was searching for someone who had gone missing. I felt my blood run cold and my wrist began to ache as I stared at the picture the officer held. It was the same girl I had seen a couple weeks ago. He asked me if I'd seen her, and I told him that I had. A mix of relief and suspicion flashed across his face. I explained that I saw her standing near the cornfield out back, and when I attempted to talk to her, she ran into the cornfield and disappeared. I left out the part about her skin melting off her face. The officer thanked me, and it wasn't long until there were multiple police cars out in front of my house. They weren't there for me, but since this was the last place she was spotted, they used it as a search point. The police searched for hours in the cornfield, while I watched from my back porch. As the sun was beginning to set, I saw 3 officers and some paramedics wheeling out a concealed body on a stretcher. I was speechless, but somewhere deep inside me, I wasn't surprised. The officer told me he would have some questions for me later. The following day, the officer stopped by to ask me the general who, what, where, and when, and I told him everything to the best of my ability. He just nodded quietly while he wrote down the information. It was only when I mentioned the when did he look up at me. He told me that it was impossible for me to have seen the woman when I did, because she had already been dead for a week, or so says the coroner. He thanked me for my time and mentioned that he may still have some more questions in the future. As the officer was leaving, I asked him how she died. He looked me over briefly, and I asked if it was a wild animal or something. He just shook his head and said that they weren't sure. When they found her, all of the bones and organs in her torso had been completely crushed without any external trauma. He said he's never seen anything like it before in his life, but he said it probably wasn't an animal attack. I thanked him and he left. I'm not sure what exactly attacked that girl or why, but I can't help but think back to that night when I saw the corn moving by itself, as if something invisible and fast was running through it. I think I'm starting to realize why this house was so cheap after all. My wife Kate had recently gone on a trip with her friends. It was supposed to be one of those girls-only type things. They had all gotten together, rented a couple hotel rooms in the city, and planned to live it up, or so they said. When Kate first told me about this little mini vacation, I thought it sounded like a good idea. She was still on the fence about going, but after talking with me, I managed to convince her that it would do her some good. My wife is a workaholic. She works far more than any person I've ever met, and she rarely takes any time for herself. That's not a bad trait by any means, but everyone needs some time to unwind and blow off a little steam. Not to mention that she's been ranting over the last few months that her new supervisor is a complete asshat. He shoves all of his work on his lower employees, and still expects them to finish their own responsibilities as well. That's what happened about a month ago. Things were becoming more and more stressful at work, and right before the boiling point, my wife decided to take some extended time off. The week finally arrived, and as I was getting ready to go to work myself, Kate was already busy packing her bag. I asked her to call me when she gets there and to call me if she needed anything. She thanked me, gave me a kiss goodbye, and proceeded to climb into an SUV that sounded like it had a Katy Perry concert inside it. The day continued normally, and I finally made it home from work. The sun had long since set, and I went to bed a few hours later. I hadn't received a single call or text from Kate, though I wasn't worried. Usually when things are happening, you tend to forget the small stuff. So instead, I just texted her goodnight and went to sleep myself. The next morning when I awoke, I groggily checked my phone. I had a missed call at around 4 a.m. from Kate. She didn't leave a voicemail, so I figured she must have been out drinking all night and she didn't make it back to the hotel room until the early hours of the morning. A few more days passed and I hadn't received so much as a single word from Kate. I was starting to get a little worried, so I decided to call and check in on her. The phone rang a few times before it sounded like someone had answered, but there was no greeting. Just silence. I waited for a few seconds before saying hello. When I did, the phone immediately hung up and I was left confused. I tried calling again, and this time the phone just seemed to ring endlessly. Around an hour passed of me calling her before I got the bright idea to call one of her friends. The self-proclaimed leader of their little group, Nikki, answered on the first ring. She drunkenly shouted into the phone asking who it was, and after quite a few minutes, I managed to tell her. I asked her where Kate was, and after another few minutes, she told me that Kate wasn't feeling well and went to sleep in the hotel room. I breathed a sigh of relief and thanked her, though I doubt she heard me. After hanging up, I reasoned that when I called Kate, she probably answered in her sleep and the phone must have gotten disconnected. I decided that I would just try to give her another call in the morning. When I got up, the very first thing I did was reach for my phone and called Kate. After a few rings, she finally answered. I asked her why she hadn't called me over the past couple of days, and she told me she had gotten sick. Kate didn't quite sound like herself. She sounded very strange, apathetic almost, like all the emotion had been drained from her. I chalked it up to her being sick and offered to pick her up, but she declined. She told me the trip would be over soon and she would be home. I relented, and before I could tell her I hoped she felt better, the line went dead. The whole phone call was bizarre. Kate has been sick numerous times, like deathly ill, but somehow still managed to go to work and function as if nothing was wrong. It was just one of those weird traits that I knew about her. Another 2 days passed without any word from Kate, and as soon as I was about to call her again, a car pulled into my driveway. Kate stepped out of the car and I walked out to her. I asked her if she was feeling any better, but she just nodded silently and went inside. That was about a month ago, and I firmly believe something happened to Kate during that trip, but I've been unable to find any concrete evidence. After she made it home that first day, she went directly to bed without speaking to me. I tried to reason that she was just exhausted from being sick on the trip, though as more days went by, her demeanor never changed. She would wake up, go to work, come home, and go to bed all without hardly speaking to me. Every time I would attempt to sit down and have a conversation with her, she'd just express how tired she was and would go to bed. This wasn't normal for Kate. While she was typically quiet and reserved, She still enjoyed spending time with me and ranting about her work. That's not the weirdest thing that has changed since she has gotten back from that trip. After a week of her being back, I found myself randomly waking up in the middle of the night to find her standing next to our bedroom window, staring out of it. When I asked her what she was doing, she didn't respond. I climbed out of bed and touched her shoulder. When I did, she would slowly turn around and get back into bed. I wasn't sure what to think. Kate has never had a history of sleepwalking before. She continued to do this for the next 2 nights, and on the second night, I didn't say anything and I just watched her. She stood at the window for around an hour and a half. Then she walked out into the living room without turning on a single light. I followed her quietly, wondering what the hell she was doing. She stopped in front of our living room window and stared out of it. I was starting to get concerned that something was seriously wrong with my wife. In my desire to get some answers, I gave Nikki another call, while Kate was at work. When she answered, I asked if anything happened to Kate during the trip, and she took a few moments to respond. She said that when they arrived, that they had been together for most of the trip. She said Kate had gotten sick relatively early in the trip and stayed in the hotel for the duration. I asked if she had done anything strange, and Nikki mentioned that a few hours before the girls went to the club, Kate went to the store across from the hotel. Nikki said that she had been gone for almost an hour, and as soon as they were about to go looking for her, Kate showed up at the hotel. I then asked if Kate had been acting strange at all during the trip, and she told me no. That she was a bit more quiet than usual, but she just attributed that to being sick. Nikki said they offered to take her home, but she declined. I thanked her for letting me know and I hung up. Another week passed after speaking with Nikki, and Kate's behavior has only gotten worse. One night, I awoke expecting to find her once again staring out of the window, but when I opened my eyes, Kate was nowhere to be found. I walked out into the living room, and she wasn't there either. It took me a few more minutes before I finally found her. She was standing outside in our backyard, staring up at the sky. When I approached her, I could hear her softly whispering to herself, though it didn't sound like any language I had ever heard before. I gently touched her hand and asked if she was all right. She turned and looked at me. I'll never forget what I saw in that brief few seconds. Her eyes were as black as ink. This caused me to take a step back, but after she blinked a couple times, her eyes had gone back to normal. She quietly walked inside the house and went to sleep. During that week, I found her in a bunch of different places each night. The bathroom, standing in the dark, staring at the running shower, standing in the closet, staring at the wall. On the last night of the week, as I got up to go find her once again, I found her standing on our front porch, only she was facing our front door, standing a few inches away from it. She has since stopped from wandering around our house in the middle of the night, but has progressed onto something creepier. She now just sits up in bed and stares at me. Every single night for the past week, she sits up quietly and stares at me all night. I'm not sure what to do or who to call. I've tried looking up suggestions on the internet, but have only received a few responses. Some people mention a doctor, others a psychiatrist, and a select few have suggested contacting a priest. I'm at a loss. Yesterday, I received a call from her work. They asked me if Kate would be returning anytime soon, and when I inquired further, they told me that she hasn't been back to work since her trip. This struck me as odd, as Kate still leaves for work every single day. If she isn't going to work, then I have no idea where my wife is going all day. I'm writing this to ask for some more suggestions. Hopefully, I'll get some more answers this way regarding my current situation. Have any of you ever dealt with this type of thing before? Have you ever encountered someone who does strange things at night? It's probably nothing, and maybe she just needs time to recover. But I can't shake the feeling that Kate never came home from that trip she took. but something else did. A week ago, my good friend Johnny had come to me with another one of his crazy ideas. Johnny was the type of person who always seemed to have something cooking in that brain of his. Most of his ideas were harmless, and some were actually kind of fun. Like the time he asked me to go skinny dipping with him. I know what you're thinking, because I was thinking the same thing. Though when we arrived at the lake, he had somehow convinced 10 girls from our school to join us. We hung out all night listening to music and swimming. Hell, I even got to make out with Ashley Palmer, one of the more popular girls at the school. Johnny had sort of a superpower. He was incredibly charismatic. He could trip a kid in school and then convince him that the wall did it. Luckily, I had known Johnny most of my life and his powers didn't work on me. Sometimes. Like the time me, him, and Peter Burns were all hanging out. Johnny tried to convince me to climb a random tree we were all passing by, and when he failed to do so, turned his sights on Peter. It ended up taking a few months for Peter's arm to completely heal. Johnny came over to my house immediately after school last week to tell me about his plans for the weekend. I thought it was odd that he was so excited, but disregarded it as he told me his plan. He told me that he had started seeing this girl. Her name was Abby. And Abby, well, let's just say she likes to wear a lot of dark clothing. He said Abby and her friend wanted to hang out at the local cemetery. I couldn't help but laugh when Johnny told me. I told him that he was out of his damn mind and that there was no way in hell I would hang out at a cemetery. When he heard my disdain, he poured on the charm as much as he could. He told me that Abby's friend Natalie was extremely cute, and that he desperately needed a wingman. He said nothing crazy would happen, just us chilling with some music and maybe some drinks, but that was it. I remained resolute in my decision, until he began guilt-tripping me, bringing up all the good times we had, all the times he helped me out, etc. By that point, I was already tired of hearing him beg, so I just caved. Once I accepted, he told me he would pick me up on Friday around 9 p.m. I felt a weighted sigh leave my lungs and agreed. Friday had arrived, and I was mindlessly watching TV when my phone buzzed. It was Johnny letting me know he was outside. I breathed deeply, trying to mentally prepare myself for the night. As I walked outside, the chilly air cut through my jacket as I entered Johnny's truck. Johnny drove a beat-up old pickup truck that his dad gave to him on his 16th birthday. The rust blended in well with the orange faded paint. The exhaust sputtered while the truck rattled. I climbed into one of the small back seats in the cab. Johnny just grinned at me as I reluctantly nodded. As we drove down the road, he introduced me to Abby and her friend Natalie. Abby barely mustered a wave towards me, and Natalie quietly said hello. Johnny wasn't kidding. Abby did look like the inside of a coffin on a moonless night. Her friend Natalie seemed to be the opposite, however. She appeared very down to earth, dirty blonde hair pulled into a messy ponytail, ice blue eyes hidden behind a pair of glasses. She was cute, but I wasn't here looking for love. I was just here to help out a friend. We had been driving for nearly 30 minutes, and I asked Johnny why the cemetery. He shrugged and looked to Abby. She just returned a half-assed response. I don't know, it just seems like a cool place, she said. Finally, we pulled up to the edge of the cemetery. Abby told us to park on the side of it because the front gate was locked. I abhorred the idea of climbing over the wrought iron fence, but Abby pointed out an area where one of the bars were missing. So we all got out and climbed through the fence instead of over it. Stepping into the cemetery, I had this immense feeling come over me. Boredom. I yawned as we walked amongst tombstones and sculptures. Abby's mood appeared to have improved significantly, while Johnny just walked alongside with his eyes glued to her. Natalie and I lagged behind a little bit and chatted. She told me that her and Abby grew up together, and that Abby hasn't always been this morbid. I chuckled at that remark, and I guess Johnny heard us because he shot us both a look. The further along we walked, the closer the trees seemed to grow to each other. We finally stopped at a small collection of tombstones nestled between a few trees. Abby then pulled out a small Bluetooth speaker and began playing some type of industrial music. Johnny retrieved a six-pack of beer from his backpack and handed him out. Barely an hour into hanging out, Johnny and the Queen of Darkness were already eating each other's faces. Natalie and I just awkwardly sipped our beers. A few minutes later, there was a lull in the music. During the quiet, I heard what sounded like twigs snapping in the distance, like someone was walking on them. I whispered to Johnny, and he just waved a hand at me. Irritated, I got up and turned off the speaker. Johnny and Abby both shouted at me for disrupting the mood. I just held up a finger to my lips and tried to listen. It sounded like someone else was with us in the cemetery. Johnny chimed in, giving me a scaredy cat remark while Abby laughed. I wasn't worried about zombies, more like police officers finding a bunch of kids breaking and entering while drinking underage. I scanned around the area. The clouds were thick overhead, removing the aiding light of the moon and stars. Another twig snapped. This time it was much closer. The others heard the noise as well and quickly clammed up. Johnny suggested that we should leave, and I agreed with him. We quietly packed up our stuff, and while we were doing so, I saw something through the trees. Eyes, shining in the darkness. They were low to the ground like a wolf. I tapped Johnny on the arm and pointed. He froze almost instantly. The eyes seemed to bob up and down, like it was walking closer to us. I told everyone to calmly walk back to the car just in case it was a wolf. As we were backing away from it, it began to move faster towards us. Johnny shouted for us to run, and we did. We each broke off into a sprint, dashing past trees and through tombstones. I could feel cold air burning my lungs as I ran, when suddenly, I felt myself falling towards the ground. Something had grabbed my leg. My face skidded into the dirt, and I rolled over to see what had grabbed me, but I wish I hadn't. It looked human, partly. It hunched over me, exhaling a putrid breath on my face. It looked like a deranged homeless person. He wasn't wearing a shirt, and his skin seemed to be covered in this tar-like substance. His teeth seemed to have been filed into sharp points as he snarled above me. Stringy black hair like spider legs hung down from his head. He reached down with his grimy hand and gripped my shirt. I felt tears begin to form in my eyes. I had never been more terrified in my entire life. He lifted my torso closer to his face. I wasn't sure what to do. My whole body was as stiff as a board. Then, a loud crash shattered the silence, and shards of glass rained down around me. The thing that was holding me reared back with a howl and dropped me in the process. My back thudded against the cold dirt, and that was enough to jolt my senses. I scrambled to my feet. Johnny pulled out another beer bottle and threw it at whatever it was. The second bottle shattered against its back, and the thing stumbled to the side. We both turned and ran towards the fence. The girls were already on the other side waiting at the truck for me and Johnny. It took Johnny a full minute to stop shaking enough to put the keys in the ignition. When he did, the headlights came on and illuminated the fence. Standing on the other side of it was that creature. It was gripping the bars tightly and snarling at us, like some type of mutated attack dog. Without wasting any time, Johnny put the truck into reverse and peeled out of there. We had been driving for 20 minutes before we finally started to calm down. When we did, none of us said anything. I couldn't believe what we had seen. Natalie was softly crying to herself next to me. Johnny just kept muttering, "Shit," under his breath. Abby, on the other hand, appeared to be in shock. She just sat rigid in the front seat, her eyes wide and unblinking, and her nails digging into her knees. Johnny dropped us all off at our houses and went home himself. I couldn't stop thinking about it the entire night. I had to write down what had happened while it was still fresh in my mind. I wanted to believe that we all just got super drunk and fabricated the whole event. But when I look at the shirt that I was wearing that night, the tar-covered handprint on it is proof enough. It reminds me of how real that thing was. And it's the reason I will never go back to that cemetery again. My son Eli found it one day while we were walking a trail in between two schools. It was a small patch of green, surrounded by tall pines and myrtles all around it. I didn't remember seeing it any time previously during our walks, but the place appeared to be rather old. There wasn't much to it, just some swings, a jungle gym, and a single slide. But Eli wanted to go and play immediately. Something about the place felt immediately wrong to me. It was too quiet, too still. There was a slow fog drifting along the grass. It just seemed off. "Eli, be careful," I called out to him. Of course, being only 3.5, he didn't want to listen to me. So I just sat on the bench nearby and watched him play. I took out my phone to check Facebook and Twitter, telling him we could only stay for maybe 15 minutes at most. I needed to shoot a few messages to my mechanic and insurance company, so admittedly I was absorbed in business. As my eyes occasionally glanced up to make sure he wasn't getting hurt, I saw someone else standing there, just on the outskirts of the playground. He was a tall man, wearing a perfectly ironed white shirt and pressed dark pants. He was just standing there, staring, watching us. "Eli, we need to go home now," I called out to him. The man was making me uncomfortable. My son whined but listened to me as we left and continued down the trail. The man didn't stop watching us until we were completely out of sight. "Dad, I didn't want to go," Eli said as we made it back to our SUV. He climbed in through my side to get to the back seat. "We can come back another day, buddy," I told him. Truth be told, I didn't want to go back to that playground at all. Everything about it was giving me a very bad vibe. But I don't like lying to Eli, and I figured that as long as that weird guy wasn't there, it would be harmless. So, the next weekend I walked him back there and let him enjoy the park. He was smiling from ear to ear. It's been a while since I've seen him that happy before. I noticed also that there were other children running about, so that helped put me at ease. But then, as I watched, I also noticed that none of their parents were there. These are 5-year-olds or younger. How could any parent worth a grain of salt just let them wander out here by themselves? This trail isn't exactly well known. In fact, before we even found the actual playground, I would say I almost never saw anyone out here. So where were these kids coming from? I wondered. Their echoing laughter was more intoxicating than the fog. I tried to approach one of the children, to ask them their name and where their parents were, but they were too shy. In fact, they all seemed averse to talking to me altogether. I suppose that's fair since I was a stranger. I got that uneasy feeling in my gut again, and I called Eli to leave. This time he was even more upset. "I don't want to go," he shouted. I hadn't seen him act this mad since he was sick and I had previously promised to let him play outside. Probably the last time I had failed to keep my word. "Buddy, we can't stay here forever. Come on, let's go," I insisted, but Eli wouldn't listen. He ran to the top of the slide and sat down defiantly. I hated to be mean, but I didn't want this habit to continue, so I snatched him down and scolded him. "Don't run away from me like that again," I told him. Eli looked confused. I knew he still didn't understand why he had to always listen to me. It broke his heart when we left. I felt awful. The other kids just stopped and stared as we walked away, like they were sad to see him go too. Another day, Eli told me that he missed his friends. "Which friends, buddy?" I asked. "At the hidden playground," he said. The name he gave it was disconcerting, but fitting given the fact that it did seem hard to find. In fact, when Eli wasn't with me, I couldn't seem to find it at all even when I tried. "I don't think we should go back there again, bud. It doesn't seem safe. That equipment is pretty old," I told him. I tried to reach a compromise and tell him that I could take him to one of the other parks around town, but Eli wouldn't listen. "It's special," he whined. He was getting to be temperamental, and as much as I wanted to make him happy, my instincts told me to put my foot down. "Look, I just want you to be safe, okay?" I told him as he cried next to me. Eli didn't talk to me for a few days after that. I guess he figured the silent treatment would change my mind, but I remained resolute and didn't even go towards that trail again. Eli grew sadder and sadder, refusing to eat or sleep. All he seemed to care about was going back to that place, the hidden playground. It was starting to make me worry. Was there something wrong with him? He was always in his room and rarely came out. Finally, after a few days, I gave in and told him we could go back one last time. You should have seen his face light up. It was like a kid on Christmas morning. He was so happy as we made it towards those creepy swings. But my defenses immediately returned when I saw that tall stranger nearby. Why was he always here, watching these children play? He truly made me uneasy. "Eli, stay close to where I can see you," I told my son. The man was approaching and offered to push him on the swing. "Don't touch my kid," I warned the stranger. "Dad, I'm gonna be okay," Eli said in frustration. For 3 years old, he always acted like he was 30. "Your son is safe with me," the stranger agreed. "Do you want me to call the cops?" I said angrily. But the man paid me no mind. He helped my son into the swing and began to push him. The smile on Eli's face was so big, stretching from ear to ear. I was a mix of emotions, trying to decide how best to handle the situation. "Look how happy he is here," the stranger said as he stepped away from Eli, and then gestured to the other children nearby, though I'm sure they hadn't been there a moment before. "They all are," he added. The way he said it made a chill run up and down my spine. Their laughter continued echoing in the still air. "What is this place?" I nervously asked. "I keep them safe until they are ready to move on," the stranger explained softly. He was looking at Eli and seeing him laugh. It sounded perfect. "Move on?" I repeated. His words made sense, but they sounded hollow and distant. "When they aren't ready, they stay here," he added. I felt my mouth go dry. My son got off the swing and chased after some of the other kids nearby. "Stay? He can't stay," I said desperately. My hands were shaking yet felt paralyzed. I called to Eli to leave, but he wouldn't acknowledge me. "It's okay to let go," the man insisted. He touched my hand and smiled. His hand was warm and calming. Eli ran up next to me and tugged at my pants. "Dad! Dad! There's a treehouse and a merry-go-round. Can I go, Dad? Can I?" he pleaded. I don't think I can remember a time he was happier. I got down on my knees and ruffled his hair. Under the hairline, I saw the scar that ran across his head, from where the car had struck him. The truth came crashing down like a ton of bricks, and tears welled up in my eyes. It was time to let go. "Sure, buddy. Go have fun." He hugged me as tight as he could, and then ran towards the tree line. The tall man followed behind, and then nodded towards me in thanks. A moment later, they were gone. I stood there a few moments longer, transfixed by the sights I had just seen, watching as the swings and the slide fade away before me, until nothing was left besides the green grass at my feet. I still go by there from time to time now, to lay down some flowers. Sometimes I see another parent doing the same, and we share a bond of silence over our loss. And sometimes I hear the children laughing, and I know they are where they are meant to be. It was supposed to be just another uneventful night alone. I had spent a lot of nights by myself without the ever-watchful eye of my parents. Being only 15, some people might consider that neglect, while others may just think it's unimpressive. A good friend of mine would often brag about staying home alone frequently at an early age. It wasn't as impressive when I found out that his single mother worked 2 jobs to support him. It was quite sad, actually. Ironically, another friend of mine who was 2 years older than me tells me he's not even allowed to go outside after 8 p.m., let alone stay at the house by himself. I, on the other hand, have carefully crafted a trust between my parents. I never begged nor pleaded that I was mature enough to be left alone. I just did what I was told, and eventually, the opportunity presented itself. My dad had come to me one night when I was 13 to tell me that him and Mom were going out to see a movie. They had attempted to find a babysitter but were unsuccessful. So instead, they asked me if I would be alright with staying home alone for a few hours. I shrugged nonchalantly, trying to act as aloof as possible. I told him I'd be fine and that I'd just play some video games and go to bed. My father reminded me about my homework, to which I groaned an agreement. They left, and I nearly lost myself in the excitement. I know it may not sound that thrilling, but I'm sure a lot of people remember the first night they got to stay home alone. I ran around my house causing a ruckus for about 15 minutes. Then, the reality and boredom set in. I retired to my bedroom and played video games most of the night. Around 10 minutes before they returned, I hastily scribbled some answers on my homework and dove into bed trying to force myself to sleep. I heard them open the door to check in on me before slowly closing it. After that night, being left home alone lost its glamour. Don't get me wrong, every time it happened was a welcome event. I could watch movies my parents didn't quite agree with. I could play video games endlessly. And the fridge was a smorgasbord of snacks. So long as I didn't make a mess in the kitchen and didn't set the house on fire, everything would be fine. But that brings me to last night. My parents were both heading out of town to visit my aunt and uncle, probably my least favorite people on the planet. They were awful, and I loathed going there. Every time my parents would make me, I would have to endure my aunt lecturing me on her plethora of rules, while my uncle would just berate me. I once walked out of the bathroom at their house and had forgotten to tuck my shirt in. My aunt snatched me up by the collar and shouted clothing etiquette in her house. My uncle just likes to make jokes about my appearance or intelligence. The phrase, "dumbass kid," has been uttered on more than one occasion. These instances only seem to happen when my parents weren't nearby. Trust me, I've complained to my parents about them, yet they would just tell me that my aunt is very particular about her house, and that my uncle lost his filter in the war. So, when my parents were preparing to leave, my mother said the magic words I wanted to hear. "You don't have to come if you don't want to." I feigned disappointment when she said it, but inside I was an explosion of happiness. During their packing, they gave me the rundown on everything I needed to know. They put all the emergency numbers on the fridge, including their own. They left me $40 to order pizza over the weekend. Then, they warned me that if I do anything wrong, that I'll reap the consequences. As I stood there on the porch watching them drive away, I felt a twinge of remorse for not going with them, but the thought of my aunt's screaming face quickly diminished it. I headed back inside and fell onto the couch in the living room. I laid there for an hour or so, changing the channel on the TV every so often. After an hour of mindlessly frying my brain, I heard a knock on the front door. This jolted me out of my daze, and I quickly turned off the TV like I had been doing something wrong. When my senses came back to me, I got up and walked over to the door. I didn't think we were expecting anyone, so I was hesitant. I slowly turned the knob to the door and cracked it open. Nobody was there. I opened the door a bit further and saw a delivery package sitting on the porch. Those delivery guys are like ninjas, I swear. I laughed off my nerves and brought the package inside. When I set the box down on the counter, I noticed something strange. The TV in the living room was on, though I was positive I had shut it off when I first heard the knock. I turned off the TV once again and went into my bedroom to play some video games. It seemed like I had only been playing for 20 minutes, but when I looked at the clock, nearly 4 hours had passed. The sun had long since set, and I rubbed my tired eyes. When I took my headset off is when I first heard a new noise. It sounded like a rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere, though I couldn't determine the location. I thought it was a leaky pipe somewhere in the house. I got up and went to the kitchen to grab a glass of water before heading to bed. I looked around the darkened living room while I sipped my water. I'm not sure if it was just the lack of light or my growing fatigue, but the room felt ominous. The whole house did, in fact. I quickly finished in the kitchen and walked briskly back to my bedroom. After changing and getting into bed, I found myself unable to sleep. I just laid in the darkness, listening to that phantom tapping. A few minutes later, I started to notice something about that tapping noise. The sound was moving. It was faintly echoing from my living room and moving down the hall towards my bedroom. I couldn't be certain, but that's what it sounded like to me. My nerves came back as I laid on my side watching my door. I half expected something to burst in and attack me just then, but nothing did. Only the tapping persisted. An hour ticked by, and the tapping started to move again. By this point, I was certain it wasn't just a leaky pipe. The tapping followed along my wall, up onto my ceiling, before stopping directly above my head. I felt my throat tighten as I stared at my ceiling without blinking. Then, I saw something begin to take shape above me. I know this all sounds strange, but trust me, I'm not entirely sure how to explain this. I watched as a hand began to push its way through my ceiling. It wasn't like something was in the attic clawing its way through the wood and drywall. No, it was like something from another dimension was now entering my room. The fingers pushed through first, followed by a hand. The pale skin was almost indistinguishable from the white paint which coated my ceiling. An arm followed next. Then, a few inches away, another hand appeared. The hands and arms dangled lifelessly from my ceiling. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Then, what appeared to be black strings began to poke through in between the two arms. It was hair. Slowly, the hair grew closer to me as I stared in disbelief. Then a head began to take shape. The head was facing away from me, so I couldn't see its face right away, only more black hair. Then the shoulders formed until half of its body was now dangling from my ceiling to just above my head. The body twitched slightly, like an electric current was jolting through it. Slowly, the body began to bend backwards, and the head lifted up to face me. A gasping, wheezing sound filled my previously silent room. That's when I saw her face. She looked like a woman in her early 20s, maybe. Her eyes were glassy and vacant, yet somehow, I knew she was still staring directly at me. But what terrified me most about this woman hanging from my ceiling was her mouth. She was completely missing her lower jaw. Her tongue dangled near her face as viscera coated the remnants of her mouth. She wheezed as she stared at me, her arms growing closer and closer. I wanted to scream, but at the same time, I didn't want to move for fear I would induce a reaction out of her. Her hands reached my face. Her fingers felt like icicles against my skin. I instinctively shut my eyes, praying this whole thing was just some horrific nightmare. She forced her frigid fingers into my mouth and attempted to pry my jaw open. Suddenly, I felt my senses come back to me and I screamed, swinging at the creature wildly. I flailed frantically and rolled out of my bed. I dashed out of my bedroom, down the hall, and called my parents immediately. My mom was understandably upset when I called her, but I didn't know what else to do. I told her that I was having a pretty messed up nightmare and asked her to stay on the phone with me while I went to check my room. The woman was gone, and so was that ominous feeling I had felt previously. My mother tiredly told me they would be home tomorrow night and told me to go back to bed. I thanked her for answering, but after I hung up with her, I didn't go to sleep. I stayed up all night watching TV in the living room with all the lights on. I'm not sure what or who that was or why it even targeted me. Maybe it was just looking for someone who was all alone and decided that I was an easy target. Maybe it was just an extremely vivid nightmare. I don't know. But I think the next time my parents decide to go out of town, I'll be going with them as well. I started to feel it a few days ago. It was a strange feeling, something that I had never felt before. It felt like a mix of being stoned and vertigo both at the same time. Euphoria combined with a paralyzing fear. I wasn't sure what brought on this sensation while I stood in my kitchen washing dishes. It was like the feeling had just come out of nowhere. It's possible I could have just been dehydrated, or maybe I had locked my knees while standing at the sink. I found myself hunched over, gripping the countertop to steady myself. My legs began to buckle, and I tried my best to stumble away from the kitchen. Not 2 seconds had I exited my kitchen did the feeling subside. I felt completely fine. I felt like I had felt before I went to do the dishes, in fact. I stared into my kitchen, still pondering what had caused that. I rubbed my eyes and checked the time. 11:30 p.m. I had work in the morning, so I resigned myself to doing the dishes the following day after work. I shut off the lights, got changed, and quickly drifted off. While at work the next day, I asked my coworker if he had ever felt the feeling I had previously described. He made a snide remark about feeling it when he slept with my mother last night, and I just responded to him with a very slow clap. The workday ended and I drove back home. I tossed my bag on the sofa and went into the kitchen to grab myself something to drink. As I was making my way to the fridge, I passed by the sink and I felt my knees grow weak. The strange feeling was still there. I staggered backwards towards the kitchen doorway and leaned against it. When I did, the feeling began to fade. I took a few steps away from the kitchen and the feeling subsided more and more. I considered that my kitchen was haunted, but quickly banished that idea, though there was something strange happening. I took a few steps towards the kitchen door and I could faintly feel it, like an itch in the back of my mind. I took a single step into my kitchen, and it grew in intensity. I left my kitchen and quickly grabbed my laptop. I began searching for articles or forums regarding what I was feeling. There was almost nothing reported apart from medical and mental issues. I briefly considered my health, but I felt fine outside of my kitchen. I then thought about my mental status, but wondered why my brain would cause this feeling in only one specific spot. The search results became fewer and fewer after that. Some sites mentioned possible mold or lead poisoning. These both seemed much more likely, as under my sink could very well have been mold, and I had been drinking tap water up until I first felt that feeling. I breathed a happy sigh and contacted a mold removal company. They said they would be able to send someone out first thing in the morning. Since I had the next day off, I agreed. After I was finished, and since I couldn't seem to enter my kitchen, I ordered a pizza for dinner and went to bed. The following morning, I was awoken to my doorbell chiming loudly. I looked at the clock on my nightstand. 7 a.m. I groaned as I rolled out of bed and groggily made my way to the door. The man standing on the other side was far too happy this early in the morning. He greeted me with a nasally voice that grated on my eardrums. I sleepily led him to the doorway to my kitchen and pointed to the sink. Even though I was still half asleep, I could still feel that sensation. The man nodded to me and walked into my kitchen. I half expected him to collapse, but he didn't. He just sauntered over, opened the cupboards underneath my sink, and began to examine it. Seeing him unaffected by this feeling caused the rest of my brain to wake up. He scanned around with his pocket-sized flashlight for a few minutes before standing up and walking over to me. He told me there was absolutely no mold that he could see. I was stunned. I thought for sure that was the cause of all this. While I had him here, I asked him to check my bathroom as well. Yet, that only yielded the same results. He apologized for not being much more help, and he left. After he left, I walked back over to my kitchen and noticed that the cupboards were still open. I inhaled a deep breath and walked over to them. The feeling was overwhelming, yet I persisted. I knelt down and examined the cupboards for myself. There was absolutely nothing under my sink aside from a couple cleaning products. While I was on my hands and knees looking under the sink, I felt something new. A warm sensation coming up from the floor in front of my sink. I felt around trying to keep my mind focused, and realized that there was heat coming from a small section underneath my floor. That had to be the cause of all this, I thought. I crawled on my hands and knees out of the kitchen. Once I crossed the threshold, I stood up and went to my utility closet to retrieve my crowbar. I once again entered my kitchen. The drone was growing more and more intense. I jammed the end of the crowbar into the floor and began to pry away the wood. 2 planks came free, and as soon as they did, that feeling completely stopped. The sudden release from that intense sensation caused me to exhale deeply. I sat next to the newly formed hole in my floor for a few minutes trying to catch my breath. As my breathing calmed, I felt my curiosity grow. I wondered what could have been in my floor that caused all this. I looked inside, and what I saw was not what I was expecting. I thought that there might have been some irradiated material or something, but what I found was a small black box. The box was metal and appeared to have strange markings engraved into it. It wasn't much bigger than a shoebox. I fished it out of the floor and set it in front of me. A million questions began to run through my head. Where did it come from? Why was it giving off heat? And what was inside? I flipped open the 2 metal latches on the front of the box and slowly peeled back the lid. I half expected it to explode in my face when I did, yet nothing happened. There was a handwritten note inside. When I first looked at it, I immediately recognized it as my own handwriting. Though that couldn't be possible as I hadn't written any note, nor did I place it in any box like this. Not to mention the fact that this box seemed to have been in the floor for a very long time. The note said, "I'm sorry. I've made a huge mistake, and I'm trying to fix it. Hopefully I can find a way. I must find a way." Next to the note in the box was a loaded handgun. I'm not much of a gun person, so I gently picked it up and set it away from the box. The last item inside was a photograph, and seeing it caused my heart to beat faster. The picture was of me, though I looked different. I appeared much older in the photograph. Standing next to me was a woman who I immediately recognized as my girlfriend Becky, but she too also looked older. There was no way this picture could exist, because not only had I never taken a picture like this, but I had just started dating Becky 2 weeks ago. I placed everything back into the small metallic box, and placed the box in my closet for safekeeping. I repaired the floor in my kitchen and I spent the entire night thinking about what I had found. This discovery has brought on so many unanswered questions. Like, was that truly me and my girlfriend in that photograph? If it was, then why did I put it in a box with a gun? More importantly, how did that box get underneath my floorboards to begin with? This house was built a decade ago, long before I even bought it. And then there's the note. Who exactly was I apologizing to? And what was the huge mistake I made? Lastly, there's that strange feeling the box was emitting. That euphoric vertigo feeling. I'm not sure why that was happening or why it stopped once the box was revealed. I'm not going to pretend that I understand any of this because, quite frankly, I don't. I'm not even sure who to talk to about this type of thing. Do any of you have any ideas regarding my situation, because I'm at a loss here? I think I'm going to try to examine the box more closely tomorrow. And I'll try my best to let you all know if I do find anything more.